Hey there folks, and welcome to the channel. Today we're looking at audio and USB routing, including how I get my audio to all my monitors and headphones, how I get the audio into my DAW for recording, and how I get MIDI data into and out of my DAW. My last video on MIDI routing has received over 35,000 views in its first 2 weeks and has helped many people get a better understanding of how they can connect their gear. Today's video will also hopefully benefit you, trigger some ideas, and maybe help with a problem that you've been trying to solve. And it completes the whole picture with all the connections that you'll need using my current studio setup as an example. First off, here are all those MIDI connections from the last video. Everything is connected and set to different MIDI channels, providing flexibility in how I control it all. I won't go through this again today, but do check out the video that I will leave a link to in the description down below. At the bottom of this diagram, it says all hardware also connected to PC via individual USB and to mixer via audio cables. The key thing here is that the MIDI connections in this diagram coexist with all the audio and USB connections that I'm about to show you. You see, in my studio I have a sort of dual setup that can either be used with the PC and a DAW like Cubase or Logic Pro, or DAWless as the saying goes, without a PC. In DAWless mode, everything is connected and routed using good old-fashioned 5-pin MIDI cables, and all the audio is routed through to my mixer, out to the audio interface and onto my monitors and headphones. But when I turn the PC on and go into DAW mode, everything is enabled by USB. So let's have a look at how all the gear is connected. Yours will be different, but the concepts are the same and should translate to any setup, big or small. Here is all the gear in my studio. All the gear in the top 2 rows is connected to the PC via 2 powered USB hubs. This allows the DAW to recognise the devices, for them to be able to control things in the DAW like VSTs, for any MIDI data generated while playing them to be recorded into the DAW, and for MIDI data to be sent back out of the DAW to them if required. We have 2 MIDI controllers, a Korg Nano Control 2, which controls some basic Cubase functions, my Bigfoot USB condenser microphone, a Spark LE drum machine, and a Roly Seaboard Rise 49. Then we have all my hardware synths. As was seen in my last video, don't forget to watch that. These are all also interconnected via 5-pin MIDI. Next up, we need to get the audio out of the hardware synths. The TR-8S runs from its stereo outputs to mono inputs 1 and 2 on the mixer, with each being panned fully left and fully right. This could go to a stereo input, but as you'll see in a second, they're all filled. The Neutron runs 1 audio cable into mono input 3 on the mixer. The Pro 1 also runs a single cable into mono input 4. The Polybrute connects from its stereo outputs to the first stereo input. The DeepMind 12 connects to the next set of stereo inputs, the Matrix Brute to the next, and the MODX 8 Plus to the final set of stereo inputs. Then, as an optional extra, I have my record turntable connected to the CD tape in on the mixer, and the CD tape out then runs to my desktop speakers, allowing me to hear the output of the mixer. Next, the main stereo output of the mixer goes to inputs 1 and 2 on the front of the audio interface. For info, on an interface with multiple inputs, they can function as individual mono inputs, 1, 2, 3, 4, or 2 stereo pairs, 1 and 2, and 3 and 4, or indeed 1 stereo pair and 2 mono inputs, which is how I'll be using it. This means that all the audio from my synthesizers is being sent to the audio interface as a total mix, and I adjust the volumes on the mixer and on the individual instruments to get the mix I want when playing live in the studio. The vocal effect unit then connects to input 3 on the audio interface, allowing me to keep the vocals separate from the synths. You could of course connect a mic directly to the audio interface and apply effects after in your DAW. Then I connect whichever mic I want to use to the vocal unit, dependent on what I'm doing. My electric guitar goes into input 4, and then the last thing on the front of the interface is my headphones running to the relevant socket. Now let's look at the back of the audio interface. My interface has 2 sets of main outputs, XLR and 1/4-inch jack. both send out a total mix of all the front inputs, plus whatever audio is received from the computer via USB, such as sounds from VSTs or the computer audio itself. The XLR outputs run to my studio monitors. The 1/4" jack main outputs then run to the Yamaha PA. And then I have the playback outputs on the back of the interface. I think these are specific to the Behringer. Your interface may be different, but these send out only the audio that is received from the PC over USB. They do not send any of the audio that is received at the front inputs. Playback outputs 1 and 2 are routed to the main input on my desktop speakers, which means any computer generated audio can be heard without the need for having the main mixer turned on. This whole setup gives flexibility on how I can listen to stuff, but is also good for mixing and production in that you can hear the mix on different types of speakers to make sure it sounds good on all of them. The audio interface is then connected to the PC via USB, so the audio can be sent to and received from the DAW. And the audio interface also acts as a MIDI interface for my FCB 1010, as that has no USB. That is all my audio and USB connections that allow audio and MIDI data to flow around the system, to and from the computer and out to speakers and headphones. And don't forget, all these connections are in addition to the MIDI connections that I showed you in the last video, with everything coexisting in my little synth ecosystem. But how does all this work with a DAW? How do I record the audio into my DAW? How do I record the MIDI data into my DAW? And how do I do all the MIDI routing in my DAW? Just for clarity, if you always use your computer, then you can get everything done using USB, and you don't really need the 5-pin MIDI connections, as you can get them all talking to one another through your DAW. But with the old 5-pin MIDI, you can sync and play everything without having to worry about a computer. Now, we know from the previous diagrams that all the audio is being routed to the PC via the audio interface, and all the MIDI data is being sent to the PC from each individual instrument. In addition, audio and MIDI data is sent back out from the PC to the audio interface and the synths via USB, as USB can send data in both directions, unlike old-fashioned MIDI cables, which are one direction only. Now, let's take a look at the DAW. I'll be using Cubase here. Yours may well be different, but the concepts are pretty much the same. If I want to get the straightforward audio into Cubase, I create an audio track like this. Right-click, add audio track, choose the input as stereo 1 and 2 from the audio interface, and add the track. This track will record the audio from whatever the interface is receiving at its 1 and 2 inputs, which we know from the previous diagrams is the main output from the mixer to which all the synths are connected. I can also create a separate audio track for my vocals by choosing input 3 from the interface, as shown in the drop down here, and I can create another audio track for my guitar by choosing input 4. This is great, but it does mean all my synths are on one audio track. I can get round this by playing and recording each synth one at a time on separate audio tracks. But what I can also do is set up a MIDI track for each individual synth. These tracks will record all the MIDI data from the synths as I play them, and when you play the track back, the data will be sent back out to the synths, triggering them to play live what you've just recorded. You can then also record those MIDI tracks to audio within your DAW later on. Setting up MIDI tracks is similar to the audio track setup. Right click, but this time click Add MIDI Track, and then set your inputs, outputs and MIDI channel. Here I've chosen Polybrute as the input and output from the drop down menus that, as you can see, show all the connected devices. And I'll set the MIDI channel to correspond with the actual device, which I know is channel 5. You can also name the track as well to differentiate between different MIDI tracks. And if you've got old gear that has MIDI but no USB, it can be connected to a computer via a MIDI interface or a MIDI to USB cable. To make all this easier, I've also set up a template within Cubase that has all my audio and MIDI tracks already loaded and the routings assigned. Here you can see I have audio tracks set up for the microphone, mixer and guitar. I then have a MIDI track set up for the FCB 1010, which is routed to the guitar effects insert on the guitar audio track, so I can use the pedal board to control my virtual guitar effects. Then we have a MIDI track for my TR-8S drum machine, and you can see in the routings this has the TR-8S as the inputs and outputs, and the channel is set to 10. Then I have some drum VSTs. Spark Drums has the Spark LE drum machine as the input, allowing me to control the VST with the physical Spark LE hardware. And Modern 80s Drums has the Keylab 61 as its input, whose drum pads I've configured to play the VST. Then I have MIDI tracks set up for all my hardware synths, and each of these synths have themselves set as the input and output in the routings on each track, so that they send their data to the DAW and receive it back. And then I have a whole load of tracks set up for my VSTs, each with their input routed as whichever keyboard I want to use to trigger them. But remember, within the DAW, anything can be routed anywhere. You just change the inputs and outputs in the routing section to do what you want. And that, my friends, is how everything works. How I get the audio out of my synths and into the DAW or out to the speakers and headphones. How I record MIDI data from my synths into the DAW and how I send it back out to the synths. And how I route everything in the DAW so it knows where it's receiving its signals from and where it needs to send them to. That's nearly it for today, but before I go, if you want a similar dual setup where you can go DAW or DAWless or a hybrid in between, remember to check out my other video that's linked in the description down below, as it may help to give you the full picture. Also, while you're there, why not check out my other videos and playlists? There may be some hidden gems in there for you. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this video, and if you have, please don't forget to like, subscribe and ring that bell. And if you have any questions, please leave them in the comments down below and I will get back to everyone to see if I can help. Any other comments or feedback are also highly appreciated. But for now, I've been Graham. Take care and catch you later.